To provide context to this discussion, we're joined now by Jeanne Mancini, president of the March for Life, and Carrie Severino, president of the Judicial Crisis Network. Thank you both for joining me. Jeanne, you've been at the forefront of the pro-life movement for many years. How should Catholics be thinking about this law?
Well, first of all, it's an incredible moment to learn about childhood development, right? I mean, have we ever had so many Americans talking about a heart beating at 6 weeks of development of the unborn? It's just beautiful to consider that. And it's also just amazing to see all that's happening at the level of the state. So just to reflect upon that for a minute and to know how powerful the pro-life grassroots at the level of the states is and should be. It's just a moment to celebrate, but also to pray, I think, and to fast as we're all trying to build a culture of life in our own ways.
And Carrie, how does this law actually work? What are the specifics of enforcement? I know there's been a lot of outrage over the $10,000, what some people are calling bounty, that comes with suing someone over an abortion procedure.
Oh, right. So the meat of the law is that it does prohibit abortions after a fetal heartbeat can be detected, which of course is typically about 6 weeks. But it does so in an unusual way, particularly because other laws regulating abortion tended to get struck down before they were even enacted. So this law, instead of having the state enforce that against abortionists, it has it where an individual could enforce it through a lawsuit. It's not the only kind of law that works that way. There are other federal laws that allow individuals to say if you identify a case of fraud, for example, that you can bring a lawsuit and then get what in that case maybe you could also term was a bounty for having identified that. But really it's an unusual structure that was designed to help it go into effect before the courts were able to block it. Now, in order to actually come to a conclusion as to whether it's constitutional or not, which would be farther down the road, they would actually have to perform an abortion and have someone then sue either the abortionist or someone else who's contributing to helping procure that abortion.
And the rumor on most major networks is that the Supreme Court's refusal to block the Texas law undermines Roe v. Wade and Casey and effectively overturns them. Can you clear that up for us, Carrie?
Yeah, it actually doesn't do that. Really, the ruling had to do with who can be sued in this case. And as I said, since the state isn't actually enforcing this law, when the abortion groups were suing the state, they were suing the wrong people because they aren't the ones tasked with enforcing the law. So that was the real reason the Supreme Court didn't take up the case at this point, allowing then the law to go into effect. If there were a real situation where someone sued someone for procuring an abortion under this law, then there would be proper defendants, and then you'd have a chance where the Supreme Court could get down to the real question of, is it constitutional, which of course implicates Roe versus Wade. But that's several steps down the line. Chances are that wouldn't happen certainly anytime sooner than the case they already have teed up, which I know we could talk about later, that is going to address the core question of whether Roe versus Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey are good constitutional law.
That's exactly right. Jeanne, knowing the issue of abortion restrictions will be discussed at the court, many people are pointing to the consequences of abortion restrictions, citing that we'll see back alley abortions and women crossing state lines. How are pro-life groups in Texas responding to this and caring for women?
Well, really courageously. And of course, they've had such an infrastructure already set up in Texas. When you compare the number of pregnancy care centers to abortion clinics in Texas, there are 10 PRCs to every one abortion clinic in Texas. What we saw is that the same day that September 1st, that this was enacted, that it began, the state also passed a $100 million piece of legislation that would help support women with alternatives to abortion. So the Pregnancy Care Center, in addition to that funding stream, is such a wonderful support. Collectively around the country every year, they also provide over $100 million in free resources. So this can be diapers, formula, childcare, housing, ultrasounds, et cetera. So we're seeing, sort of this untold story of the Pregnancy Care Center really come to the fore in terms of the lives that are being saved every day in Texas right now, which, Montse, by the way, is about 130 lives. And what we're hearing from the Pregnancy Care Centers is that they're maybe, doing as many ultrasounds as they typically do in 2 weeks in the time period of 1 week over the course of this last week.
Wow, over 100 lives per day that are being saved. And can you explain a little bit more about this flow of money coming out from the state of Texas? What is it specifically supposed to do?
So this supports alternatives to abortion. So things like basically people who are considering adoption, again, giving some resources to women. So anything from material resources to housing, et cetera. So $100 million that was simultaneously funded for this very purpose.
Carrie, President Biden's Justice Department moved quickly to file a lawsuit claiming that the law in Texas is unconstitutional. What were the grounds for that lawsuit?
Yeah, it's pretty much of a legal stretch in that case, Montse. They basically said, the Constitution prohibits it, which under current constitutional law with Roe and Casey, it does. And they say, well, we basically have a freestanding right to sue over that. And they say they can sue not just the state of Texas, which, as we discussed, isn't actually the one enforcing the law, but all citizens of Texas or anyone who might sue in Texas. That's just not how lawsuits normally work. It's a real bank shot. And I think it's more of a publicity stunt than anything, because they're just trying to do something to show the deep pockets in the abortion industry and other dark money groups who are supporting this administration, got them into office, who want them to be as radical as possible on this issue. It's sad that a president who once was touting himself as a pro-life politician now is taking not even just a neutral stance to this, but really an aggressive and very extreme stance on this issue.
And really quickly, when it comes to issues of federal versus states' rights, is there anything that was pulled out in this lawsuit that could potentially be concerning for the people of Texas?
The biggest problem here is that the Department of Justice under Merrick Garland is trying to invent a freestanding right to just sue any state that they think the law doesn't comport with the Constitution. That's never how it's worked. You need to have an actual issue and a case before the court where there's facts on the ground. So if there were facts on the ground that they're saying there's an abortion here that is protected by the Constitution and Texas is prohibiting it, then they could maybe bring the lawsuit. You can't just go in and say, hey, we don't like Texas's law. That is a real overreach of the federal power. States, as we know, particularly because the Constitution doesn't actually speak to this issue, it's an issue that really the states have the right to determine how they're going to protect their citizens, including both the women who are pregnant and their unborn children.
Jeanne, there was one thing that was extreme and concerning for us is the Justice Department's claim in their case that unaccompanied children receiving federal refugee services need access to abortions. Is this something that's been a priority for the administration before?
It has, but I don't think they've ever pushed it this far. So we can think back 5 or 6 years when different pro-life grantees were denied funding for this very office, and that was sort of peripheral to this issue. And then more recently, under the Trump administration, there was an issue with transport of minors to potentially receive an abortion. So now to push this as far, even in the language to talk about a so-called right for these young people who've been traumatized, I mean, already coming into our country and really are being used as a pawn, in my humble opinion, in this situation is just really heinous.
Carrie, last question for you. How does this case, the Texas case, and the lawsuit from the federal government, how does it affect the future of the Dobbs case out of Mississippi that will be heard in November by the Supreme Court? Well,
I think the ruling we've already had in this case gives me hope in that case, because we saw when the emergency stay application was made, people trying to block this law before it even went into effect, that we had 5 justices who stood firm against a lot of political pressure, a lot of pressure in the media saying, oh my gosh, the sky is falling, you have to block this bill. And we're still hearing their hyperbolic rhetoric that really is distorting what the bill is even actually about. And the fact that we have 5 Supreme Court justices who are willing to say, you know what, even in the abortion area, the standards of law, the rule of law stands firm. That's very good news. You should be 9 justices, right? But unfortunately, we've seen in many cases that justices kind of suspend the rules when it comes to abortion. We now have a court that doesn't seem to be doing this.
That's right. We're not sure what that will be, and we're very much looking out for that. Thank you so much, Jeanne and Carrie, for your analysis on this important situation.
Thanks.
Thanks for having us.
If you're pregnant and need support, there are many organizations that can help you, including the Gabriel Project, which is a parish-based ministry to support pregnant mothers and their unborn children. You can find out more at gabrielproject.org. There's a directory of cities they provide assistance in at the bottom of their page. You can also visit thesistersoflife.org, who operate in several U.S. cities and in Canada.